They say all roads lead to Rome, but some led straight into hell disguised as marble palaces, silk robes, and the illusion of grandeur. Beneath the golden ceilings of the Roman elite, boys were bought not for labor but for silence, for beauty, for obedience. These were not warriors or citizens. They were children, stripped of name freedom and future train. They smiled on command. They were praised for their grace, paraded like trophies, and discarded like property when youth faded. To the outside world, they lived in luxury. Behind closed doors, they endured a system so dehumanizing it barely left scars because it didn't need to. It hollowed them out from, this wasn't love. It wasn't sex. It was ownership disguised as intimacy. And it thrived at the very heart of the empire we were to Sarsha. History remembers Rome's victories, its emperors, its marble. But it forgets the boys in the shadows, the ones who were never meant to be remembered. This is their story. Not carved in stone, but buried in silence. Until now. The boy's journey didn't begin with footsteps. It began with erasure. His name was the first to vanish, spoken one last time in the fading language of a homeland he'd never see again. The next to go was his voice, swallowed by fear, trained out of him in whispers and warnings. Then his memory, not of events, but of who he once was, what he loved, who he trusted, all of it carefully stripped away like a garment that no longer. This wasn't just slavery, it was identity demolition. The Romans didn't merely own bodies, they reprogrammed minds. The boy would be groomed to speak sweetly, to smile on cue, to silence his instincts. He would learn that obedience bought survival, that affection could be weaponized, and that pain didn't always come with bruises. The walls of his new world were draped in velvet, but they closed in all the same. What makes this cruelty so chilling is not just its existence, but its elegance. Rome didn't need chains when it had custom. It didn't need cages when it had culture. The system was self-cleaning. No blood on the floor, no cries echoing through the halls, just quiet compliance dressed in silk and gold. And yet deep inside, a fracture forms. A boy forced to perform gratitude while mourning himself becomes something else, not quite slave, not quite free. Suspended between spectacle and silence, every compliment becomes a leash, every soft touch a claim. The line between survival and surrender begins to blur. Roman society applauded this arrangement. The wealthier the master, the more refined his taste in servants. No one questioned what it meant to turn a child into a symbol of status. No one asked what was broken to make them bend so gracefully. The boy would sit quietly beside his master, trained to laugh at the right jokes, nod at the right opinions. Guests would admire his composure, his posture, his restraint, never suspecting that what they saw was a performance. A life rehearsed, not lived. And as night fell and the candles flickered against polished marble, he would return to his quarters, silken, spotless, and suffocating. There, in the darkness, the silence would speak louder than any cry. The villa was silent, but not peaceful. It breathed with tension. Behind every carved arch and painted ceiling was the quiet choreography of servitude. The boy had arrived. No fanfare, just a hand guiding him through columned halls, past statues of gods who never spoke, and into a chamber that would be his world and his prison. Everything inside was beautiful. That was the first warning. Silks were folded on stone benches, perfumed oils rested beside a bronze mirror. There were sandals that fit too perfectly, tunics tailored too precisely. It was not kindness, it was branding. Every item reminded him, you are no longer yours. He was told when to speak, when to smile, how to sit. The slightest misstep, an untimely glance, a pause too long invited correction, swift and cold. But praise could fall like honey when he played the part well. A reward system engineered not to raise him, but to mold him. He began to mimic without realizing. The tilt of the head, the softness in the voice, the submission hidden behind the compliment. He was learning fluency in a language built on power, how to be noticed without threatening, how to please without presence. This wasn't survival, it was transformation. The boy who had arrived from the marketplace was already disappearing, replaced by a reflection shaped to match his master's desires. Even his silence was no longer his own. It was designed, calibrated, practiced. There were nights he sat by the flickering oil lamp, staring into his reflection. Not out of vanity, but confusion. Which one is real? The face I wear, or the one I lost? But the mirror never answered. It only gave him what the world demanded, a polished surface. And in that surface, the damage took root, not loud or visible, but slow and internal. A rewiring of selfhood, a breaking that left no scars, only scripts. From the outside, guests would remark on how fortunate he was, how well cared for, how graceful. No one questioned the cost of such perfection, because the boy was not screaming, he was smiling. And in Rome, that was enough to make the world look away. To be chosen was never a blessing. In Rome, being chosen meant being watched. Adored, yes, but also controlled. It meant living beneath the weight of someone else's gaze, every movement observed, every expression measured. The boy wasn't just expected to serve. He was expected to anticipate, to intuit desires before they were spoken, to become an extension of another man's will. At first, the attention felt like safety. After the marketplace, the villa seemed orderly, predictable. But the predictability was a lie. It only lasted as long as his master's mood. One misplaced glance could unravel everything. Kindness was conditional. Favor was currency. Love, if it could be called, that was just another form of possession. He learned this quickly. One morning he was offered grapes and honey, a soft touch to his shoulder, a compliment about his voice. That night, silence. No explanation. Just a locked door, a cold room, and the unbearable weight of uncertainty. Was he being punished? Forgotten, replaced. That confusion was by design. Masters used emotional instability as a leash. The boy was made to question himself constantly. What did I do wrong? How can I fix it? In this state, he became more pliable, eager to earn back affection, desperate to avoid exile. Obedience in Rome was not demanded through violence alone. It was sculpted through withdrawal. This tactic didn't break bones. It bent the soul. And so he began to internalize the rules of survival. He smiled more quickly, laughed more softly, hid hunger, shame, fear. He became the ideal companion, silent when needed, radiant on command. But inside, something was splintering. Not loudly, quietly, like a whisper cracking glass. The house staff avoided him, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. No one wanted to be seen showing him kindness. That might threaten the master's control. Even among other slaves, he was alone, highly visible, yet utterly isolated. He was the boy everyone noticed, but no one truly saw. He had become what Rome wanted, beautiful, voiceless, obedient. But beneath the silk, a quiet rebellion stirred, not in words, not in defiance, but in memory. A flicker of the child he used to be. And in that flicker, the first ember of resistance began to glow. By the end of the first year, he had become invisible in plain sight. He walked with grace. He served with precision. He said just enough to be charming, never enough to be real. Every gesture had been rehearsed. Every emotion rehearsed out. The boy didn't exist anymore, not in the way boys should. What remained was a performance so seamless, even he had started to believe it. In Rome, the most prized concubines weren't the most beautiful. They were the most compliant, the ones who no longer flinched when touched, who smiled even when nothing was funny, who had forgotten how to say no, even inside their own minds. This was the training no one spoke of, the refinement behind the elegance. He had been taught to dress in silk, but also to become silk, soft, smooth, absorbent. A texture, not a voice. An offering, not a presence. They fed him philosophy, Plato, Cicero, words about reason, virtue, the soul. But those lessons weren't for his liberation. They were part of the illusion. An educated boy made a more compelling accessory. He could recite poetry at dinner. He could debate politics in whispers. He could mirror his master's brilliance, and in doing so, disappear beneath it. He wasn't expected to think, only to reflect. And he did. Every night alone, he reflected, not in marble pools or polished mirrors, but in fragments, memories that slipped away like water, cupped in trembling hands, the taste of bread from home, the sound of his brother's laugh, the color of his mother's shawl. They came back not as comforts, but as wounds, because remembering meant grieving. And grieving had no place in this house. To survive, he had learned to exist without existing, to become a silhouette, a curated presence that never cast a shadow. Some called it discipline, others called it grace. But deep down, he knew what it really was. Erasure. His body moved through the villa. His voice charmed the guests. His skin gleamed beneath the oil lamps. But the boy? The boy had gone quiet somewhere deep inside, curled inward, hidden, waiting for a world that might never return. He wasn't alone in the villa. Not truly. There were others, boys like him, different only in accent, skin tone, or the way they bowed. Some had been there longer, some had just arrived. They rarely spoke to each other. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. The rules were unspoken, but absolute: do not trust. Do not bond. Do not let your pains show in front of another. What looked like companionship from the outside was something far more cruel, a silent competition for survival. The master favored variety, and favor in this house meant safety. A smile from him could mean a reprieve from punishment, a warmer bed, or simply a moment of peace. But there were only so many smiles to go around, only so many nights, only so much protection. So the boys learned to outshine one another, not with fists, but with charm. One sang better, another danced, another could speak 4 languages and flatter with perfect timing. Each became a mirror, polished and eager, trying to reflect something the master might desire. But admiration was a weapon here. To be praised meant someone else was overlooked, and in this hierarchy of proximity, to be overlooked was dangerous. The boy learned to watch the others as closely as he watched the master. A flicker of envy, a shift in tone, a passing glance, everything carried weight. Suspicion bloomed where trust should have been. Even kindness felt like strategy. A well-placed compliment could soften a rival. A misstep could doom you both. This was Rome's genius. It didn't need chains to keep its slaves in line. It made them chain each other quietly through fear, jealousy, and need. There were nights when he caught another boy's eyes across the hall. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. A brief moment of shared ache, but then it would vanish, swallowed by silence. Neither could afford the luxury of connection. Because here, survival wasn't just about pleasing the master, it was about not being the one forgotten. And in this war without weapons, the battlefield was their own dignity. Every smile could be a surrender. Every silence a scream no one dared to hear. To the outsider, it looked like privilege. He wore robes dyed in Tyrian purple, a color so rare it was reserved for emperors and gods. Gold adorned his wrists, pearls hung at his neck, and perfumed oils marked his every entrance. At feasts, guests whispered about his elegance. Some envied him, others desired him, but none of them saw the truth. He was not being honored. He was being displayed. Every jewel was a shackle, every silk garment a mask. These gifts weren't acts of generosity, they were symbols of ownership. The more beautiful he appeared, the more invisible he became. No one asked what it cost to maintain that beauty. No one asked what lived beneath the surface. The upkeep of his appearance was relentless. Each day began with inspections, skin hair, posture, breath. Any flaw could draw reprimand. Meals were portioned, exercises demanded, grooming rituals enforced. At times, ointments burned his skin. At others, cold blades removed the slightest imperfection. Pain was normalized, just another tax for being seen. He didn't own his body. Not really. It had become a canvas for another man's desire. He was shaped, sculpted, and adjusted like furniture in a room meant to impress. Even education, which once felt like a gift, revealed its edge. He was taught to quote the Stoics, to sing poems of longing, to laugh at jokes about power, but always in ways that entertained. He could speak of virtue, but never of freedom. He could debate love, but never question who was allowed to feel it. He became fluent in performance, an actor so convincing even he sometimes forgot he was acting. But at night, when the garments came off, when the mirrors stopped reflecting and the oil lamps dimmed, something inside him whispered, "Still, you are not what they see." And for a moment he believed it. But morning always returned, and with it the silk, the gold, the smile. It was the price of staying useful, because in Rome a beautiful object was cherished, until it wasn't. In Rome, beauty was never a blessing. It was a contract with no signature, no terms, and no escape. And like all contracts made in the shadows, it had an expiration. The boy was now older, not old, not broken, just less new. The eyes that once followed him with hunger now passed over him in favor of someone younger, softer, untouched by time. He could feel it in the silence. It was always silence that came first. No more invitations to the master's table, no more lingering glances, no more praise whispered like possession. Just distance, measured, practiced, final. He still performed, still dressed in gold, still moved like a ghost wrapped in silk. But now he wasn't the centerpiece. He was a reminder. That time passes, that beauty rots, that even the finest porcelain can crack, and Rome hated reminders. The punishment wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel in the way people think of cruelty, it was absence. A door closed, a voice that no longer called his name. His chamber remained, his duties continued. But the purpose, the illusion of value, was gone. That was when fear returned, the same fear he'd felt the day he was purchased. But now it was colder, more mature. He wasn't afraid of pain. He was afraid of becoming nothing. There were whispers, of course, among the staff, among the other boys, of what happened to those who aged out. Some were sold to lower households, still used but without the elegance. Others simply vanished. One morning they were there, the next gone. No questions asked, no explanations given. Rome didn't like clutter, and old concubines were clutter. He had no savings, no papers, no name that belonged to him. His education, though impressive, was designed for entertainment, not survival. He could sing in Greek, recite Virgil by heart, and debate ethics over wine, but he had never been taught how to live freely. This was the final cruelty. They had taken everything that might have helped him escape and replaced it with ornamentation. He had been beautiful, useful, adored. Now he was disposable. He began to walk differently, straighter, quieter, as if trying to shrink from time itself. Some nights he stood at the edge of the villa's outer wall, staring into the hills beyond, imagining a road that might still belong to him. But every road out had a gate, and every gate had a key he'd never been given. There are rebellions that shatter empires, and then there are rebellions so small, so silent, they go unnoticed by the world, but mean everything to the one who dares to make them. His rebellion was not with knives or escape. There were no doors to kick open, no guards to outrun. His cage was made of custom, not chains. His rebellion was internal, carved in secrecy, stitched into stillness. It began the moment he stopped smiling when no one watched. For years he had smiled as reflex, and offering a shield, a survival tool. But now, alone in his chamber, he allowed his face to be bare. He stared into the mirror, not to rehearse, but to remember. He touched the curve of his own cheek as if to ask, "Is this still mine?" Some nights he whispered his birth name into the darkness. Just once. Just softly. Like a sacred word no one else was allowed to hear. It didn't change anything, but it was his. And in a life where everything had been stolen, even one word was an act of reclamation. He began to notice others, too, boys who had been there longer. Some had folded into the role completely, smiles etched into their bones, eyes like still water. But a few, just a few, still flinched at unexpected touches, still paused before answering, still carried a flicker of something real beneath the surface. In rare moments, when the master was away and the villa fell into hush, he and another boy might sit near the fountain, never speaking of their pain, but sharing a silence that acknowledged it. A glance, a gesture, a passing of bread without words. These were not friendships. Rome didn't allow that. but they were reminders. You are not alone in this forgetting. One day he refused to sing, not loudly, not dramatically. He simply said he was tired. The punishment was subtle. He was ignored for a week. His meals were colder, his presence less tolerated. But still, something inside him surged, not pride, not victory, but residue, proof that a part of him still existed beneath the role. Rome had trained him to be obedient, polished, quiet. But it had failed to extinguish his awareness. And in that awareness, slow, quiet, fragile, grew the smallest seed of power. He didn't know if it would save him. But he knew now not all resistance looks like running. Sometimes it looks like remembering who you were before the world told you to forget. History did not remember his name. It remembered his masters, the senator, the scholar, the noble patron of the arts. His name was etched in stone, carved into arches, whispered in libraries. But the boy. He was never meant to be remembered. That was the design. Rome celebrated its thinkers, its conquerors, its poets. It honored those who built roads, raised armies, ruled provinces. But the boy who stood silent beside them, the one dressed in silk and trained to laugh at the right moment, he remained invisible, even in plain view. And yet he had existed. He had once loved figs more than honey, had once feared thunder, but pretended not to, had once tried to memorize the shape of his mother's hands because he knew he'd forget her face. He had lived not as a servant, but as someone whole before Rome cut him down to fit its appetite. Even now, centuries later, his story lingers not in statues, not in scrolls, but in the silence between the grand narratives. In the gaps where something is missing, in the emptiness behind the empire's golden mask, because every civilization builds itself on a cost. And somewhere beneath the marble, beneath the law codes and military triumphs, lie the bones of boys who were never allowed to become men, who were reduced to decoration, to shadow, to whispers behind locked doors. His survival was not marked by escape. He didn't overthrow his master. He didn't flee into legend. He simply endured. He remembered. He carried a self so small, so protected, that even Rome could not reach it. And that endurance, that refusal to fully disappear, is a kind of immortality. Because now you remember, not his name perhaps, but his truth, his pain, his quiet war. You remember that beneath every polished empire someone was polishing, that behind every banquet someone was starving. That power is always built on silence, and history only changes when someone dares to speak for the silenced. So, no, his story is not written in gold. It is written in you now. And in that remembrance he becomes more than a body once owned. He becomes a warning, a question, a ghost the empire could not bury. Empires fall, but the silence they teach that survives. Rome no longer rules the world. Its legions are dust, its temples ruined, its emperors long dead. And yet the systems it normalized, the cruelties it made, elegant, the lives it discarded in silence, those echoes remain. The boy you met in shadow has no statue, no tomb, no lineage. But he left behind something heavier than gold, a mirror. Because the machinery that broke him was not unique to Rome. It was built from something older: power, unchecked desire, without conscience, beauty used as a weapon. And though the faces have changed, though we no longer wear togas or walk marble courtyards, the architecture of that violence still lives in modern skin. We see it in every system that turns people into products, in every child robbed of voice, of home, of future, in every institution that teaches obedience before identity. We see it when power becomes spectacle and vulnerability currency. That boy's story isn't ancient, it's cyclical. And what frightens us most is not that Rome did this, it's how easy it was to forget. Because forgetting is the final violence. To forget him is to let the system win, to allow the silence to swallow him twice, first in life, then in memory. But to remember to speak his story aloud is an act of defiance. It's a fracture in the illusion, a refusal to decorate history without questioning the cost. His pain may have gone unnoticed in his time, but not now, not here. You've heard it, you've felt the shape of it, and in doing so, you've become part of a long and necessary repair. This story isn't just about Rome, it's about us. what we dignify, what we excuse, what we label civilized while standing atop the bodies of the forgotten. The boy never escaped his gilded cage, but we can escape ours, by refusing to look away, by asking the harder questions, by honoring what was never meant to be honored. Empires are built on silence, but so is healing. And every time we choose to remember not the victors but the vanished, we plant something holy in the ruins, a kind of justice not written in law but in memory. A voice long buried finally heard. Some things the empire could touch his name, his body, even his future. But there was one thing it never fully claimed, his soul. It had been buried, yes, starved, bent beneath years of silence and forced smiles, but never broken. And in Rome, where power was measured in control, this unclaimed part of him, this quiet fragment of truth, was a quiet rebellion all its own. He had no audience. No one praised him for holding on to it. No one noticed when he sat in the garden alone and let the breeze touch his skin like it still belonged to him. But in that small act to feel without being commanded, there was dignity. There was memory. He no longer believed in rescue, not from outside, not from fate. But he began to understand something deeper. Salvation is not escape, it is recognition. The world would not remember him. That was its nature. It remembers marble more easily than flesh. It builds monuments to power, not to those crushed beneath it. But somewhere deep within, he carried a version of himself untouched by Rome, untouched by ownership, untouched by fear. It looked like nothing, but it was everything. It was the part of him that still grieved even when grieving was forbidden. The part that still loved even when love was weaponized. The part that still believed in softness, not the kind that was demanded, but the kind that was chosen. He had seen cruelty gilded in gold, had seen obedience mistaken for beauty. But he had also seen what couldn't be caged, a shared glance with another boy. A remembered song from childhood hummed under his breath, the scent of something familiar carried in the wind from a distant kitchen. Rome had taken much, but not that. And maybe that is what makes his story endure, not because he triumphed, not because he escaped, but because he remained human when everything around him demanded he become something else. To live without being fully erased. To suffer without surrendering the final piece of self. That is what the empire could never own. That is what survives in silence long after the statues crumble. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep, something uncomfortable, something real, then don't let it disappear into the like this video, not just to support the channel, but to honor the voices history tried to erase. Share it with someone who still believes that truth matters more than comfort. And subscribe, because here we don't just tell stories. We uncover what was buried. We remember what was forgotten. We speak for those who had no voice. Every click is not just support. It's resistance against forgetting. Let's build something louder than silence together.